the listeners, the viewers, the interneters, everyone that's on here. And I want to tell you that we have an incredible program lined up for you today. Today we're going to find out one of the deepest, darkest secrets, one of the biggest conspiracies that has gone on in the United States of America, and it's gone on since the 1950s, and it impacts on the lives of literally millions of Americans. If you, like me, were one of the people back in the 50s, 60s that got the polio vaccine, you need to pay careful attention to what's going to be said today, because this may be the answer to one of the most puzzling facets of recent modern American life, which is, why has the incidence of cancer literally gone through the roof? Why are there so many people suffering from cancer today like never before? We've all heard the pat excuses. Well, it's the food we eat, it's the air we breathe, it's pollution, it's the water, it's who knows what all. But let me tell you, here is the story that you need to hear. And tonight, my guest is Ed Haslam. He works for a newspaper in Florida. He is an intrepid researcher, and he has spent the better part of the last 2 decades, I suppose, researching the story of Mary, Ferrie, and the monkey virus. Now that sounds kind of a trippy title, and it sounds like something you might find on a comic book, but there's nothing comic about the story that Ed has to relate. Ed, thank you for being with us tonight.
You're welcome. Good to be here, Jim.
Let's start off by just going back to the 50s and kind of laying the groundwork. I think most people, certainly those that were alive back in the 50s, realized that polio at that time was one of the most dreaded of the diseases. This is long before AIDS ever came on the scene, but so many people were affected by polio. President Franklin Roosevelt, of course, had suffered from polio and could barely walk, but most people were not aware of this, but because at the time before television, you only saw photographs of him from the waist up, and you didn't see pictures of him being handed downstairs and carried places. But polio was the dreaded disease of the 50s. So, Ed, why don't you take it from there and explain what brought about the situation that we're discussing?
Okay. Well, first of all, just about everybody out there that's of age, say 40 or above, has some kind of direct recollection of the hysteria that went on with the polio vaccine.
Right.
And just about everybody got it. And to most people's experience, there was a sugar cube. And actually, before the sugar cube, there was a syringe. And
I can remember getting the sugar cubes.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to say we're standing right at this moment in time at the 50th anniversary of the release of the polio vaccine. And
50 years on.
50 years, we're right on the anniversary right now, and I've been watching the press, and this is one of the most wonderfully orchestrated stories in the history of American media. And this story, as everyone is familiar with, is once upon a time there was this wonderful man named Jonas Salk who fought the great forces and invented the magic vaccine, and it was released, and we vanquished this terrible disease, and now everyone lives happily ever after. That is the story. That's almost verbatim off of the CBS website today. Now, what I did was I investigated a murder, and I wound up investigating an epidemic, okay? But I'm going to go back over the mechanics of how we got into this. Polio was a bad disease, everyone who has seen the pictures of the crippled children laying in their iron lungs and stuff like that should have some real heartfelt sympathy and empathy for the dimensions of this very bad disease, okay? And as I talk about it, if I sound a little callous on it, it is not because I'm not sympathetic to the dimensions of suffering that went along with this. It's that I'm aware that today we have 15 cases of soft tissue cancer for every 1 case of polio that we had. And so what we're going to be getting into is comparing the dimensions of one epidemic with the dimensions of another epidemic, and the cost of that, not only in human suffering, which is enormous, but the cost of it in terms of taxing our health system and those sorts of things. In order to understand this conversation, you got to go back to say, well, how did they make the polio vaccine? And there was a man, several men, but one in particular from Harvard University by the name of Enders, who figured out how to grow things in what's called a petri dish. And he figured out how to grow the polio virus on monkey kidney cells. And Jonas Salk borrowed this idea from him. And Jonas Salk created this vaccine, which was called a killed virus vaccine. And basically what he did was he drowned the polio virus in formaldehyde. And then they would inject it into a person, and the structure of the cell was there, so the body would recognize it as an invader, but it wouldn't be alive so that it could infect the people. And this would trick the human's immune system into creating an immune response. Now, what most people don't know, because Jonas Salk has got the greatest PR team in the world behind him coming out of Pittsburgh, okay? What they don't know is that the Salk vaccine backfired. It failed. It was withdrawn from the market. When it was withdrawn from the market, the head of health, education, and welfare, who was the wife of the governor of Texas, was fired. So was the entire management of the National Institute of Health. And Salk's vaccine was pulled off the market. Now, they handled the PR with a kiss on the cheek. They had Eisenhower give him an award on the front lawn of the White House and all that other stuff. But, boy, they swept him aside and his vaccine aside, and they went ahead with a second vaccine developed by Albert Sabin. Now, Albert Sabin said, you know, you really don't need – there's several strains of polio. You don't need to base the vaccine on the most deadly strain. You can use one of the weaker strains. And when you use one of the weaker strains, the body still recognizes it, and it gives the body a time to warm up and prepare its response. And this Sabin vaccine is the one that was in the sugar cube that just about everybody got. Now, both of those vaccines were grown on monkey kidney cells. And when
that's right. And why were they grown on monkey cells instead of there was some people said they should use fertilized chicken eggs or even human placental cells. Why did they decide on monkey cells?
Well, the natural host of the polio virus is the rhesus monkey, and it likes the kidney cells. It was accessible. It didn't get into the ethical issues of human issues, and
but then that brought up another problem, didn't it?
Well, when they took out the polio virus from those kidney cells to make the vaccine, they took out every other virus that was in those cells, and that is what we're going to get to as the real problem behind this. So the name of the book, which is Mary, Ferrie, and the Monkey Virus, is about a intersection of three things. One was the monkey virus that was in the polio vaccine that we've been talking about. The Mary is the name of a woman who was murdered, a doctor who was involved in cancer research who was murdered. And the Ferrie is another character that we'll talk about later. So we got three different people, and the question is, or three different ideas here.
Well, let's go ahead and just tell them right now, Ed. Let's tell them that the Ferrie in your story is none other than David Ferrie, who was a cashiered airline pilot in New Orleans and who was experimenting with cancer
in the JFK thing, yeah.
Exactly. And the chief suspect, the man that Jim Garrison, the district attorney in New Orleans, originally wanted to prosecute in in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, except David Ferrie turned up dead before he could do so.
And the question is, who was this woman doctor who was associated with David Ferrie? And why was she associated with it? And what does it have to do with this monkey virus that was in the polio vaccine? And that is the tangled web of what was going on in New Orleans. And so,
well, let me see if I got this straight. When they began to develop the polio vaccine from monkey glands, they were also picking up a monkey virus, which, to my understanding, depresses the immunization system and actually, in some instances and over time, will allow cancer to grow and spread.
No, actually, it's worse. It's worse than that, Jim. It's worse than that, and I'll explain the mechanics of it when we come back from break. But
all right,
this thing causes cancer.
Causes cancer. There you go. And from my information, Dr. Harold Cox, the principal bacteriologist of the United States Public Health Service, had forbidden his scientists from using monkeys because of that very danger that the monkey virus represented.
The entire Scandinavian medical group forbid the polio vaccine from being released because they were concerned about the monkey virus contamination of the vaccine. Now, why was the hysteria in the United States so great? Why was the fear of polio so great that we were willing to accept what was a risk that the Scandinavians would not accept in order to get rid of one disease?
Exactly. And that's what we'll discuss when we come back from the break. This is Jim Mars. We're back here on Dreamland speaking with Ed Haslam, and we were discussing the adulteration of the polio vaccine by a monkey virus that actually causes cancer. So, Ed, are you telling us that the reason that cancer has grown to epidemic proportions in recent years very well might be laid to the polio vaccine, which was supposed to save us from another ravaging disease, polio?
Yeah, that's essentially my proposition. And I will say that I really am not the one who originally came up with it. The person that originally came up with that idea, which is, let me state it, that we have mass inoculated the entire American population and many other populations with a cancer-causing monkey virus, which is sexually transmitted and will be causing cancer for generations. That idea, which is the biggest mistake in the history of government, was originally stated by a woman, not in those exact words, but clearly that idea, by the name of Bernice Eddy. She was the #1 vaccine safety tester for the National Institutes of Health. She was directly involved with the polio vaccine. And she, with her research partner, Sarah Stewart, discovered a virus that caused cancer, a virus they named polyoma, and that same virus was later tracked to be a virus in the polio vaccine, which was given the less hysterical name of SV40. Now, I found it interesting on this 50th anniversary of the polio vaccine that I did a search on the search engine for polio and SV40 and didn't get a single hit out of today's news. There's plenty of information on the web about it, but nothing in the current news.
Exactly. Well, I have a quote here from Dr. Bernice Eddy to Congress, and she said, this was as late as 1972, she said, if you continue to allow these contaminated vaccines to go out, I guarantee you that over the next 20 years you will have epidemics of cancer. She's proven to be correct, hasn't she?
In my opinion, yes. And I think that that woman who risked her life and her career to make statements like that really deserves some recognition. I mean, if not an official,
But here on the 50th anniversary of the public release of polio vaccines, we don't really hear anything about Bernice Eddy in the mass media, do we?
No, we don't, and I think that's because there are some secrets that are so dark that it's easier to keep them secret. It's like the old Rocky and Bullwinkle show, when Bullwinkle would try to Rocky would say, "Hey, Bullwinkle, watch me pull a rabbit out of this hat," and he'd pull a lion or a tiger out of the hat, and he'd say, "Wrong hat," and put it back in. It's such a horrible, costly mistake that threatens the entire public health service apparatus. It threatens the treasure of our wealthiest corporations. It threatens the political reputation of the politicians of the day. This is the skeleton in the American closet. This is the worst possible scenario. This is the darkest secret out there. And when you start to realize how bad this thing is, how much someone like Richard Nixon feared the idea that the American public would find out that he just inoculated their children with a cancer-causing virus, then you start to understand the dimensions of fear and the dimensions of cover-up that people were willing to go through in order to keep subjects like this quiet.
Exactly, Ed. But now, as an old journalist, we always have learned to follow the money. Isn't there a financial factor involved in this? And is it true or not that some of the people involved in the promulgation of the polio vaccine had vested interest in seeing that vaccine become successful?
Well, you got a couple of planks to that. One is what is known as the March of Dimes, which was the committee or whatever on infantile paralysis, was originally started by Franklin Roosevelt and some advertising people in New York. Okay, when you have the President of the United States, particularly the longest-serving President of the United States, who happens to be a victim of the disease, behind the project, you have a lot of political inertia behind it. So that's one of the issues. And then, as the torch got passed from the Democrats and the Republicans were on guard, and I'm talking Eisenhower and Nixon, when the thing was released.
Yeah, let's not forget that Richard Nixon was vice president during the 50s under President Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes, for 8 years, from 52 to 60, which was the time frame that all this stuff happened in. And just kind of a reminder, President Eisenhower, Ike, had been the general in Europe, and his basic focus was fighting the Cold War, and he really focused on the international stuff and let Nixon handle a lot of the domestic stuff. And they were both running around kissing kids and collecting roses on this polio thing, and they thought it was going to be a great political triumph when it happened. But Bernice Eddy, at the last minute, well, what happened was Salk had his previous professor, his mentor, Dr. Francis from Michigan, test his vaccine. And there was a big press conference. And at the time, there were 100 kids a day getting polio. There was a lot of pressure to get something done and get it done fast. And they thought they had the fix, right? And within like 24 hours of Dr. Francis announcing that the polio vaccine worked in most cases and was safe, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare signed the release order. Okay? Now, it was in those circumstances of pressure from the White House with the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare personally stepping up and signing the thing that they turned around and handed Bernice Eddy the vaccine that they were about to release. And she went down the hall and injected it into some monkeys, and A couple of the monkeys fell over dead, a couple of them got crippled, and a couple of them got sick.
Hmm.
And Bernice
so they were actually giving them the disease.
And she went back and said, you got a problem here. She said, it's all with this one batch from Cutter Laboratories. Okay? And this is not the cancer-causing problem. This is just the polio thing didn't work and was giving people polio. Okay?
Right.
It was giving the monkeys polio. And so she said, do not release this. She was the senior vaccine safety testing officer of the National Institutes of Health. I mean, this sounds vaguely familiar to the Iraq situation with the weapons of mass destruction, that the professionals were saying, don't do this. And the politicians were saying, hey, don't you understand we're in a game here, you know? And they blew off Bernice Eddy. And one of the stockholders of Cutter Laboratories was a powerful and very well-known doctor from New Orleans. His name was Ochsner, Dr. Alton Ochsner. And Ochsner, when he heard this...
Very well-known in New Orleans and founder of the Ochsner Clinic down there. And, by the way, through my research, he also was heavily involved in the anti-Castro, anti-communist political activities going on down in New Orleans back during the late 50s and 60s.
Yes, and I think it's appropriate to mention he was also the president of the American Cancer Society, which will become relevant later. But this man, who was chief of surgery at Tulane Medical School, was so convinced that the vaccine was safe and so convinced that that woman in D.C., Bernice Eddy, was wrong, that he called the faculty of Tulane Medical School together and inoculated his grandchildren with the vaccine that they were about to release. The result?
And what happened to them?
His grandson died. His granddaughter got polio.
Well, you think he would have learned the lesson there and tried to stop everything. Is that what happened?
Well, I think he certainly learned a lesson there. And it certainly meant to the people in question that he had a vested interest in some of these other issues because he had both one foot in cancer and one foot in polio. It's very interesting to note that one of his pet medical students at the time, who was an expert, quote, in polio, who kind of couldn't find a job, but he helped her find a job up at the National Institute of Health. She wound up marrying the boss of one of these women we were talking about. And the last time I looked, and this is not true today, but this was true just a couple of years ago, the last time I looked at the directory of the National Institutes of Health, that one of them, the husband or wife, was head of the National Cancer Institute, and the other one was the head of the National Institutes of Health.
So these people are still maintaining control over the cancer information.
40 years later, through the funding apparatus, yes.
Right. Now, how does the murdered scientist, that would be Dr. Mary Sherman, how does she fit into all of this?
Well, you were one of the first people to write about Mary Sherman and
That's
point
right.
out that
my book Crossfire.
Right, and that she was somehow, and it was kind of hard to explain at the time, connected in some way to the JFK activities.
Well, she was in contact with David Ferrie. We know that. She was in contact with some of the other people, and her death, which seems to be a combination of burns, apartment break-in, attack, stabbing, all seemed to be very unusual for a long time. And I think there were a lot of the JFK assassination researchers who somehow thought her death related to what she may have known about the assassination, but I think you can give us a different view of that. This is Jim Mars. You're back with myself and my guest tonight, Ed Haslam, here on Dreamland. And we are talking about an incredible story that involves the adulterated polio vaccines, which very well could be the cause of the epidemic of cancer that we're now seeing in the United States. We're seeing it's a tale of government skullduggery, advice and information and intelligence that was ignored. Scientists told us one thing, the politicians told us something else. You're hearing a story of greed, and now we're getting to even murder. Before the break, Ed was going to tell us about his interest in a New Orleans doctor, Dr. Mary Sherman. Ed, if you'd continue the story.
Okay, well, this, at this point, becomes kind of a situation of insider knowledge that I was raised in New Orleans. My father was a professor at Tulane Medical School. He was an orthopedic surgeon. The doctor who got murdered, Mary Sherman, was also a professor of orthopedic surgery at the same medical school. So there's only a handful of professors there. I mean, my father worked hand
Right, it's a little community. They all know each other.
Right, every day. I mean, this woman came over to our house. I remember climbing up on her lap as a child and having conversations with her. And then she winds up being the subject of one of the most mysterious and heavily covered up murders in New Orleans history. And one of the things that happens, anybody who's lived in D.C. knows this, is that the people that are supposed to keep secrets, well, they keep secrets most of the time, but they usually come home and talk to their families about it.
Right.
You start to hear things that you wouldn't hear otherwise. And then you go to school and you talk to other people who have heard things. And then there are teachers who have heard things. And all of a sudden you wind up with all these pieces of this puzzle that doesn't make any sense. And then something comes along that says, look, the stakes are too high here. I can't just ignore this stuff. I have to sort it out. And you start going through the system of saying, what really happened in her murder? Let's get the autopsy reports. Let's get the police reports. Let's get the FBI file. Let's get all this information and lay it out on the table and start putting the pieces together and see if we can figure out what happens. And what we find out, one of the pieces of the puzzle, is that the New Orleans District Attorney, Jim Garrison, had determined and made a statement in the national press to this effect that Mary Sherman was connected with David Ferrie. Now, to connect a woman who is a internationally respected, but top echelon, national level researcher from the University of Chicago with a man who was a known political extremist, wild card, engaged in violent activities like bombing Cuba, is a very dangerous combination of resources and intentions. And what I was told in the late 60s was that they were working on a biological weapon for the purpose of assassinating Fidel Castro.
You say biological weapon, in other words, let's inject him with something that would give him cancer.
Yes, a monkey virus that would give him cancer. A monkey virus.
See, and that would be perfect, wouldn't it? Because by this time, Castro was cozy with the Soviet Union. This way, if he dies, he leaves the scene, but it would appear to be natural causes. The Soviet Union couldn't accuse us of killing him and couldn't prove anything, and we wouldn't have World War III. Right?
I mean, stakes get enormous in this thing. And when you get into that, and you say, well, wait a second, did these people really have this capability? I mean, I think it's pretty clear they really had those intentions. But did they really have those capabilities? Who was this woman? Who did she know? And what was going on in science at the time that she might have had contact with? And Garrison found a document in David Ferrie's apartment that was a medical treatise on using using viruses to create cancer. Okay? Now, I went back to the scientific directories, and started looking up people and figuring out who knew who and who went to school with who and everything else. And what I discovered was that Mary Sherman entered the very small, very elite medical school of the University of Chicago at the same year that a woman named Sarah Stewart did. Now, I think it's pretty easy to say two women in a male-dominated medical school starting as freshmen at the same time, they probably became pretty good friends. Now, when you realize that it was Sarah Stewart who discovered the cancer-causing virus in the polio vaccine, then all of a sudden you realize that her friend who is researching bone cancers is probably in the loop. And in fact, there's a website. It's called imfmaybe.org. It's not International Monetary Fund. It's got to do with bone cancers. And the rise in children's bone cancer is really outrageous. And I don't even get into it in my book, but I do, in my book, show graphs of the rise in soft tissue cancers. And they are breast cancer, prostate cancer, lymphoma, and melanoma, which is skin cancer. Okay? The rise, not the total level, but the rise of those four cancers is from before the polio vaccine to today, and discounting the increased age and discounting the increased size of the population, is still 15 times larger than the polio epidemic at its peak. We're talking a number that's in the vicinity of 500,000 cases a year. Now, you lay $100,000 a case on it just to give you a number, and you're looking at a number like $50 billion a year, and you got the government standing there, knocking the flour off their hands, saying, but we don't have any responsibility here. I mean, people get cancer, And it is pretty clear, and I'm going to give you some sources on this to focus on. The United States government allows a man from Italy to be in the United States. He has a green card issued by the National Institutes of Health. He is the top DNA researcher from Italy. He is here working at, I think it's Loyola University in Chicago, not the University of Chicago, but Loyola University. And his name is Michele Carboni. And he says words, very direct language to the effect of, this monkey virus that we're talking about, SV40, is the most carcinogenic substance we have ever identified.
Wow.
Now, what it does is when a cell reproduces, it's kind of like a knitting process, okay? And you have ribonucleic acids, and they make a deoxyribonucleic acids, which is DNA, right? In that process, there's a switch that says grow. And then there's a switch that says stop growing. Okay? Well, if it turns off the switch that says grow, then you never see the cell. But if you turn off the switch that says stop growing, the cell goes grow, 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 and that's what cancer is.
That's when you got a cancer. Well, Ed, let me ask you this. It's been said that the virus that's been detected in tumors has been detected in tumors removed from people who were never inoculated with the contaminated vaccine. Now, some people think this may be concerned then that somehow this simian immunization virus 40 can be transmitted from one person to another. What do you know about that?
Well, there's 2 points there, and let me give you the sources on them. One is the University of Ferrara, a very respected Italian university, did a survey of the semen of Italian men, otherwise healthy, active people out there in the population, and they found this SV40 virus in the semen of 45% of the Italian men.
Holy cow.
Now, that means to me that it is sexually transmitted, period. The other point...
wow, something else to worry about. Now, over and above AIDS, BD, now you got to worry about monkey virus 40.
Okay. Now there's another woman whose name is Janet Butel, B-U-T-E-L, at Baylor University in Texas. She is an expert in this virology area. And in today's press, there was an article that quoted her, and her concern was that they are finding SV40 in the tumors of children who were too young to have participated in the contaminated polio vaccines and too young to be in the sexually active population. She didn't add that part. I added that part, but that's the point.
But that's only reasonable, and that must mean then that they're getting this from their parents. It's hereditary.
That's correct. From it, so it's being transmitted between generations. So
well, no wonder they don't want to talk about this.
Yes, I mean that's exactly the point. I mean, who wants to stand up and admit that they're responsible for this? Nobody.
Yeah, right. Okay,
and so when you turn around, Jim, at this point and say, "Oh, by the way, we discovered that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with Dr. Oshner and all this stuff," everybody wants to say, "Rocky, put the rabbit back in the hat."
That's right. Let's don't talk about this. Well, let's return to
Dreamland.
David Ferrie. Let's return to David Ferrie. So it's well known, it's historic fact that in his apartment, he had cage upon cage of white mice. And so you're saying that he was working, he had a cancer lab going there.
Yes.
And this is Jim Mars, and you're listening to Dreamland, and we'll be back with more of this incredible story right after this break. Howdy, this is Jim Mars, this is Dreamland, and we're back with this incredible program with Ed Haslam, author of Mary, Ferrie, and the Monkey Virus. And let me tell you something, we're only skimming the top of this story because we have a very limited time here on this program. If you want to read the details, see the scientific studies, see the charts and graphs, get the full details for yourself, be sure and pick up a copy of Mary, Ferrie, and the Monkey Virus, which, Ed, how would they go about ordering one of those?
Well, I think they check with the website of the Dreamland show, and they'll tell them how.
That's right. So check with Dreamland website, and you can learn how to get this book. We were now talking, we've come full circle. We found that the polio vaccine that was given to some 93 million Americans back in the 50s contained a monkey virus, simian immunization virus 40, which not only allows cancer but actually causes cancer. And, of course, I'm sure there would be lots of controversy over whether or not that really happened, but there can be no question that the incidence of cancer in recent years has just exploded, and it continues to grow as the people who got the polio vaccine continue to grow older. And then we've also found out that one of the labs that were working to try to stop this epidemic was in New Orleans and run by a man by the name of David Ferrie, who played a prominent role in District Attorney Jim Garrison's prosecution of people he said was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
Jim, let me grab it from you right there, just because I want to clarify a point here. The question is, if you are a senior government official and you realize that you have just mass inoculated, 200 million doses of a polio vaccine that's contaminated with a cancer-causing virus, your number one priority is to figure out a solution before the public finds out a problem. Okay?
That's right. You've got to find a cure.
And so what I am saying is that the United States government, with all its money, all its power, all its scientific stuff, kicked into high gear to do a medical Manhattan project to develop a vaccine. And they got the top people in the country involved in it. And one of the top people in the country was the president of the American Cancer Society, or should I say the former president, because he not only knew all the resources and all the scientific issues about cancer, and he was the doctor who ran his own hospital, but he also lost a grandson to polio through this same vaccine, okay? And he brought in the highest scientific minds in the country that were involved in cancer-causing viruses, such as Mary Sherman and Sarah Stewart. Well, it turns out, you said follow the money early. The money is that Mary Sherman worked for Alton Ochsner, okay? Worked for Dr. Alton Ochsner at his clinic. And I am holding in my hand here a phonograph album produced by Dr. Alton Ochsner. And the subject is, it is the voice and recordings of Lee Harvey Oswald as recorded by Dr. Alton Ochsner in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, immediately before the Kennedy assassination. Now, I would like to ask the obvious question. What is the president of the American Cancer Society doing crossing paths, identifiably, recording it for history, with the guy who's about to be accused of assassinating the President of the United States? I mean, this is such a ludicrous question, but here it is, in my hand.
Well, I would say the answer to that, Ed, is simply that Lee Harvey Oswald, exactly as his mother always told me, and the evidence is now becoming overwhelming, was an agent of the United States government.
Of course.
And as
that's
such,
how we got
he
back
was obviously put in touch with one of these cancer labs.
Because they needed it infiltrated, because people close to the White House, and by close to the White House, I mean Jack and Bobby Kennedy, needed to know what the CIA was doing with these millions of dollars that Richard Nixon had spent that they couldn't find in the books.
Because these cancer labs were covert, correct?
Yes, because, and in fact, when we got into where was the cancer lab, that cancer lab was not in David Ferrie's apartment. That's the Ricochet. That's the little lab. The big lab was on the grounds of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in New Orleans. It contained a linear particle accelerator, a high-tech piece of radioactive equipment capable of mutating the genetic structure of the viruses.
Okay, well, quickly tell us what led to the early demise of Dr. Mary Sherman. Why did she die?
Mary Sherman suffered the most bizarre burns that anybody has ever seen. Her right arm was burned off. Her right shoulder was disintegrated. Her rib cages were disintegrated. The skin on the right side of her body, the muscles, exposing the right side of her body. I mean, the organs, the lungs, the liver. You could see all that. But
this is all in the autopsy report, right?
And yes, and in the photos. But the immediately, I mean, the temperatures it takes to do that, Jim, is tens of thousands of degrees.
Well, it sounds to me like she must have accidentally or somehow got in contact with that linear particle accelerator.
Immediately next to those burns is unburned human hair from her head and her pubic area and just on her skin.
So now, it wasn't fire.
Everybody at some point in their life has burned hair on their forearms around the stove. Why? Because the easy thing is the hardest thing. So how do you get a situation where the hardest thing to burn on the body is subject to so much heat that it disintegrated, and immediately next to it the hair didn't burn? Now that is the result of a high-voltage electrocution, and I'm talking millions of volts.
Right. So the newspaper stories that said she was in her bed in her apartment and had been smoking in bed and that there were stab wounds in her body and that she was the victim of a break-in are simply a cover-up to cover up the fact that she was probably killed by this accelerator.
Well, she was certainly heavily wounded by the accelerator. What's interesting about the autopsy report is it's very clear that the cause of death was a precise surgical stab wound to the heart.
So she was badly burned and then killed.
A mercy killing at that point.
Probably so.
She would have died
now,
otherwise.
All of this is an incredible story, and obviously the cover-up of the death of Dr. Mary Sherman was designed to keep people from looking into the linear particle accelerator and then into the cancer research that was going on.
Because they didn't want to get
into the adulterated polio vaccine.
Because they never didn't want to get to the issue of Mr. Nixon, did you authorize the release of the polio vaccine, which contaminated our children with the cancer?
Exactly. Now, here's my $64,000 question, because we all seen the movie JFK, Oliver Stone's movie, which of course was partially based on my book, and we all know that Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister and David Ferrie were all conspiring down there in New Orleans. But is it possible that although they were talking against President Kennedy, that the conspiracy in New Orleans had no real connection to the actual assassination in Davie Plaza, and that the cover-up of Jim Garrison's investigation and the shutting down and the derailing of his investigation had more to do with keeping the secret of the polio vaccine cancer issue than with the Kennedy assassination?
Yes, is the short answer. But let me rephrase it for you, because I think you're at the critical juncture of this whole thing, Jim.
Okay.
And that is that the entire subject of New Orleans and the right-wing loonies down there was a red herring to pull the attention away from the real source of the assassination. But I will go a step further in this, and this is my considered thought after having spent 2 decades on it. It is not where I started out on this. And that is, if you're going to go shoot Jack Kennedy through the head with high-powered rifles in broad daylight, you need to spend some time thinking about what his brother is going to do.
Right.
Now, his brother is the Attorney General.
Right. Chief law enforcement officer of the country.
Right. And has the power and resources to come after you. So if you frame one of his assets with the assassination, you checkmate him and you get away with it.
You're saying Lee Harvey Oswald was secretly working on behalf of the Kennedys?
Well, let me ask you a question. When Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union and he wanted to get back in the United States, and there were lots of people saying, I'm sorry, you surrendered your citizenship, who's the referee on that? Who is the final person who is able to say you are a citizen or you are not?
The Attorney General of the United States.
And at the time of Lee Harvey Oswald's return to the United States, who was that?
Bobby Kennedy. And you know, this does fit well with some stories I've heard for a number of years, that there was an under-the-table effort by the Kennedy brothers to put out their own operatives, shall we say, to gain intelligence, because after the doomed Bay of Pigs invasion, they realized that they were not getting proper intelligence from either the CIA or even the Pentagon. And
all right, well, Jim, let me ask you.
The non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, apparently we're not getting good intelligence even today.
Okay, but let me ask you a question. The day Mary Sherman's body was found, the Warren Commission was in New Orleans, starting their investigation.
Really?
Yes.
So there we go. So maybe it's not so far-fetched to list her. Her death is one of those convenient deaths for people that did not want the truth of the assassination to come out.
Well, if Dr. Ochsner, Dr. Ochsner had pulled the handle instead of Mary Sherman, they would have had a really hard time dragging him back to his apartment and blaming it on a lesbian sex slashing. That's
correct. Well, Ed, our time's winding up here, and I just want to tell you that this has been really an amazing hour. I hope the people out there in Dreamland appreciate the work that you've done, and I hope that they will go to the Dreamland and look up Mary, Ferrie, and the monkey virus, and just check it out for themselves, make their own decisions. But the evidence is all there, And I certainly thank you for your years of devoted research and study to, as you yourself said, one of the darkest and deepest skeletons in the U.S. closet.
Well, and I thank you for helping shine a light on it.
That's quite all right. This is Jim Mars, and I'm a new and untried host here on Dreamland, and we will be seeing you very soon in the near future. Adios.
You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that gives you the facts and tells you the secrets others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, Linda's reporting on strange lights seen over the Serpent Mound in Ohio in 2003. And could the Earth experience another devastating ice age? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. 2 years ago, between August and November 2003, 4 crop formations in soybeans were reported in that mysterious and ancient mound builders region of southern Ohio. Most important in terms of plant and soil anomalies was the first one discovered on the morning of August 24th, 2003, not far from the famous Serpent Mound near Locust Grove, Ohio. The tall soybean plants had been laid down in a geometry based around the Vesica Pisces, a sacred geometry symbol found so often in British crop formations. Its longest length was 271 feet, and there were no tracks around the entire perimeter or inside of this extraordinary pattern. You can see aerial and ground photographs of that soybean pattern at my website, www.earthfiles.com, in a new report called Mysterious Lights and 2003 Serpent Mound Crop Formation. Jeff Wilson, director of the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association based in Cincinnati, Ohio, said that soybean crop formation are very rare in the United States, and of the 100 American crop formations that he has personally investigated by August 2003, the, quote, Serpent Mound pattern is one of the most sophisticated geometries that we've ever seen, unquote. All of the electronic testing that Jeff and his colleagues did and studies of plant samples have shown statistically significant anomalies. Further, Jeff Wilson pointed out that soybeans are a tough crop to make your way through. He says, quote, it's a vine-like plant, so when you wade through the stuff, you almost have to rip your way through the plants, unquote. But there was no sign of destruction anywhere. And what none of us knew in 2003 was there were at least 3 eyewitnesses the night before at 9 p.m. who watched mysterious lights move for several minutes right over the land near the Serpent Mound. For the first time on record, Tree Pruitt of Batavia, Ohio, explains what she and her husband and brother-in-law saw during a birthday celebration at her sister's home, only about 20 minutes by car from the Serpent Mound.
Now, the lights were yellow around the outside, blue, white, and then the very center had a tiny white core, a very bright white light core. And they were far too high in the sky to have been headlights from a car, and we were on top of a hill, so it's unlikely that we were seeing a car coming towards us. And in addition to that, the lights were moving in circular pattern, and we both agreed that it reminded us of riding in the air with a sparkler on the 4th of July. They left slight tracers as they moved, and they moved back and forth as if you were slowly dangling them from a string, almost a swaying motion. And sometimes they'd move back and forth, and then one would move in a circular formation, and they would dance around each other. And we believe that there may have been up to 8 lights, individual lights. We're not positive if there were that many, but there were definitely at least 3 to 5. The spheres of light were about the size of a basketball from our frame of reference.
So these lights appear to be relatively large, and could you go over the details of the color again in that sparkler look?
Okay, well, the size of the light, being at about a 20-minute drive away from us, from where we were standing looking at them, they were about the size of a basketball to our frame of reference. So wherever they actually were, we figured they would have to have been pretty large to be that easily visible. As far as the coloration, you could distinctly see it was almost as if there were 3 circles overlapping each other, one within the other evenly. The very center core was very vibrant, bright white, clear white. Then there was a rim around that of almost an electric blue, blue as this light, the way light shines blue. And then the final rim was yellow, the yellow of a light, as if when you're using, say, a cheap light bulb through, and it casts a yellow glow to the room. So it was almost amberish in tone. And some would move back and forth, and others would move in circular patterns, and they wove around each other. It was almost as if watching a dance. It was very graceful movement. And then on a few occasions, there were sharp right angular movements, but the majority of the movements were very graceful, very flowing, back and forth and around and movements.
How long do you think you watched?
Judging that based upon the average length of how long it would take to smoke a cigarette, unfortunately. But since that's the reason we were out there, that's what we have to judge the time upon. So it may have gone on from anywhere from between 5 to 12 minutes. And we called to the rest of the family to come outside and take a look. And I asked my brother-in-law if he ever recalled seeing anything like that before. He's a total skeptic when it comes to lights, aliens, anything like that. But they do sit outside often at night and watch the stars. And he said he had never seen anything like that before. And all of us agreed that the light seemed to be coming from the direction of the Serpent Mound area, which from my sister's house would have been off to the right in our field of vision. And we actually joked at the time about, well, maybe there'll be a crop circle there in the morning. Well, we were really surprised the next day when we saw the newspaper, and there had indeed been a crop circle.
And in that downed soybean pattern of that unusual 2003 Serpent Mound crop formation, researchers found a layer of heat damage at the base of the leaf stems. The implication was that some kind of energy interacted with the soybean plants and heated up those plant cells. Biophysicist W.C. Levengood at his Pinelandia Biophysical Laboratory in Grass Lake, Michigan, has done extensive research on crop formation plants and soil since the early 1990s. He has published some of his discoveries in the prestigious botany journal Physiologia Plantarum. He hypothesizes that many of the crop formations that he has studied, including the Serpent Mound of 2003, were produced by plant interaction with what he calls a spinning plasma vortex. That vortex of stripped positively and negatively charged ions also contains microwave energies. Levengood theorizes that the spinning energy system originates high in the atmosphere from an unknown source before the vortex descends toward specific places on the Earth's surface and leaves behind the baffling and beautiful crop formations now reported in dozens of countries around the world since the early 1990s. Some crop formation investigators have also hypothesized that the mysterious crop patterns that sometimes resemble our solar system are warning humans that a life-threatening event could be in our planet's or solar system's future. Some extinction possibilities include fiery destruction by another asteroid impact, such as the one that wiped out 70% of Earth life, including the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago, or the total freezing of the Earth into an icy snowball, which has happened at least 4 times in our planet's history. The last time scientists estimate the Earth was completely encased in ice, down to the equator, was 600 million years ago. That was Precambrian, before even plants took hold in the Earth's surface. Our planet also turned into a snowball 800 million years ago and 2 billion years ago. What could cause the Earth to completely go into deep freeze? And could it happen again in our future? 2 scientists have published their theory about all this in the February 2005 Geophysical Research Letters. Professor Alex Pavlov, originally from St. Petersburg, Russia, produced a computer model in collaboration with astronomer John Bally, both from the Department of Astrophysical and Planetary Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Recently, I asked Professor Bally to explain what he and Dr. Pavlov think has periodically turned the Earth into a snowball.
The big picture here is that we live in a spiral galaxy. We live about 8.5, the term I use is kiloparsecs, but most people will be familiar with the term light year. We live about 30,000 light years from the galactic center. And the disk of the galaxy, in addition to containing stars, contains clouds of gas and dust that we astronomers call giant molecular clouds. And these clouds are, in fact, very interesting to us because they are sites of ongoing star formation and star birth. In fact, our own sun was born in such a cloud about 4.6 or 4.5 billion years ago. And the galaxy still contains quite a few, maybe of order 10,000 such clouds. And they're mostly confined to the disk of the galaxy, the place where the sun orbits in its path around the galactic center. And so on occasion, we encounter such a cloud just by random. It's a fairly rare event, but our estimates are that over the last 4.5 billion years, we must have encountered dozens of such clouds where the solar system actually enters the cloud and encounters a density of gas which is orders of magnitude higher than the average density around us today. Just for reference, the typical density of the gas between the stars is about 1 atom for every cubic centimeter. When you enter a molecular cloud, that density can increase a factor of 100 or even 1,000-fold, so that you encounter of order 100 to 1,000 molecules of mostly molecular hydrogen for every cubic centimeter. Now, the one consequence of such an encounter is that as the sun and solar system moves through such a cloud, the pressure of the encounter causes the solar wind to collapse to a fairly small radius, sometimes smaller than the Earth's orbital radius. And that means that dust particles which come in from the molecular cloud can actually be in part captured by the solar system. And what Alex has shown is that although the total effect of this dust is insignificant in terms of absorbing sunlight, because when a heliosphere is collapsed to a radius smaller than the Earth's orbit, this dust can be swept up by the stratosphere, by the Earth's stratosphere. The latency of this dust, that is how long this dust stays in the upper atmosphere, can be quite long. And so during the several 100,000 years it takes for us to pass through such a cloud, it could be anywhere from tens of thousands to maybe even 1 million years, the upper atmosphere can be loaded with enough dust so that the Earth's climate can be modified. And so what Alex has proposed is that might potentially be a trigger for these global glaciation events. And the idea is that the accumulated interstellar dust that comes in from this molecular cloud encounter can shield enough of the sun's light, so that the surface of the Earth is cooled enough so that, in fact, glaciation becomes the prevalent mode of the Earth's surface. And so you enter this snowball Earth episode.
And there are indications, I understand, in the geology of our planet that this might have happened 600 million years ago, 800 million years ago, and as far back as 2 billion years ago. And given that, as 4 episodes, is there anything out there that you and other astronomers are looking at that suggests that it could be either moderately dense or very dense gas clouds that our solar system is headed for now?
Well, the problem is, of course, these clouds form and dissolve on a timescale of tens of millions of years. And so, in fact, we don't know specifically where the clouds were, hundreds of millions of years ago. And in fact, it's even very difficult to predict when we might encounter such a cloud again. When we look around the sky, the nearest clouds are about 300 light years away from us right now, and it takes us that takes us many millions of years to travel that distance. However, the clouds themselves will change their structure dramatically on that kind of time scale. So by the time we get to a location where there might be a cloud today, that cloud may be completely dissolved. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, other clouds may reform as the interstellar gases are pushed around. So unfortunately, we cannot predict or look around the sky and say, well, X years ago we passed into a cloud, because in fact the clouds and the distribution of clouds in the galaxy changes with time on a shorter time scale than the time since the last glaciation. So our model is statistical. What we can say is by looking around the sky today, we can assess, how frequently we encounter such a cloud. And we can do that because observations of the sky show us that typically you have to move about a few thousand light years in the galaxy on average before you encounter such a cloud. And so we typically travel we're moving about 20 kilometers per second through space with respect to the background of stars and gas. And so that means that we cover about, see if we get the numbers right here, every million years we move about 60 light years. Okay, and it would take us several thousand light years before we had a reasonable chance of encountering such a cloud. And so the mean interval at which we encounter clouds is comparable to the time scale on which the clouds themselves change. So unfortunately we cannot say when the last cloud and solar encounter occurred or when the next one will happen. What we can say with a fair degree of confidence is we have not suffered such an encounter in the last few million years. Because if you look back in the direction from which the sun is moving, there are no dense clouds there today out to many, many hundreds of light years. And similarly, if you look at our projected motion into the future as we move about the galaxy, again, there's no nearby clouds along our path. So what we can say with some degree of confidence is in the last 10 million years and in the next 10 million years, there will be no such encounter in our history. So, and similarly, another 5 billion years in the future, the total amount of molecular material in the galaxy will also be lower by a comparable amount, by a factor of 3. So it not only is the process dynamic, but it appears that this process is running down as molecular clouds convert some of their mass into long-lived low-mass stars.
Which is good news for the Earth, because going into an icy snowball would really be a major extinction event.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that what we may be seeing here is that we finally, for the first time, may be coming up with a possible answer to why there have been global glaciation periods that have so puzzled scientists.
Correct.
And that the answer itself might be a phenomena in the galaxy that might not happen again at all.
It might not happen again. On the other hand, it could, mostly because of the dynamic nature of the interstellar gases.
Is there any way on our planet of looking for an absolute scientifically demonstrable piece of evidence that, in fact, this planet, at the times that this iciness has occurred, is there something in our planet that we can look at that shows us?
Absolutely. And in fact, there is a potential test. Specifically, short-lived radionuclides, so isotopes of elements that are short-lived and that require supernovae for their formation. So, for example, in most molecular clouds, if there's massive star formation going on, those massive stars will explode as supernovae. And those explosions pollute the surrounding interstellar gas and dust with short-lived radioactivities. An example being the rare species of iron known as iron-60, which has 4 more neutrons than standard iron-56. And that species has a half-life of 700,000 years or so. So, for example, if we passed through a molecular cloud that had recently been polluted by a recent supernova, then we would expect that some of the dust that the Earth swept up would be enriched in this short-lived isotope. So the daughter products of those isotopes could be identified in geological sediments, for example. And so that there are a number of potential isotopes having a variety of lifetimes, which can be used as a direct test that the Earth was polluted by some source of radioactivity which was generated in a supernova event well after the formation of the Earth, for example. That would be a test of this model.
And is anybody looking for that now?
I believe they are. And the secret here is what one has to do is do deep sea ice cores or core samples of the rocks where we think we have, where we can tell that the rock dates back to the time of this glaciation. And so the test will be to look for these rare isotopes in their daughter products. But the isotopes will have decayed. But in minerals in which these isotopes are present, the daughter products of those isotopes should be present. So there is an in-principle test, and I believe there are various groups that are, in fact, attempting to do these experiments.
What about pulling us out of these global ice ball situations?
Well, my understanding is that it has to do with the carbon cycle. The problem is if in today's geology, the climate is to some extent balanced by the balance between the rate at which carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by volcanoes versus the rate at which the oceans lock it up in minerals like limestone. Okay? If you freeze the oceans, you shut off that cycle because the atmospheric CO2 has no way of getting pulled into the water and then deposited as rock. So once you go into a global glaciation, you shut off the carbon cycle, but you haven't turned off the volcanoes, which have to do with deep mantle processes, which are well below the Earth's surface in the oceans. So volcanoes continue to erupt. But so as a result, because you can't sequester the carbon, the atmospheric CO2 increases. And that will warm the planet to the point where, in fact, you reverse the glaciation, you melt the ice, and then all of a sudden you enter a period of extremely high temperature until the carbon sequestration can remove enough CO2 to rebalance the climate. So I think the glaciations are self-limiting by the carbon cycle, in a nutshell.
And how do you freeze the tops of oceans?
You cool the planet, lower the atmospheric temperature. So if, for example, if you block 5 or 6 or 10% of the sunlight by dust in the stratosphere, the planet becomes more reflective, and hence the amount of heat that reaches the surface is diminished. Average global temperatures drop to the point where, in fact, the polar caps grow. And if you do this long enough and severely enough, then the polar ice caps can reach right down to the equator, at which point you have no open ocean left.
So it isn't like standing on the shore of New York or New Jersey and looking out on an ocean that has stopped moving because it's turned to ice the way we think of a pond.
Well, that's a good question. How rapidly would this happen? I suspect this would take tens of thousands of years because dust takes a long time to accumulate. So it's not like the movies where overnight the planet freezes. It would take, I suspect, tens of thousands of years. It'd be a very gradual decrease in global temperature at the Earth's surface and a gradual increase in the size of the polar caps until they reach the equator.
Do we know exactly when was the last time that the Antarctic was completely free of ice?
I think it's known. I don't know that myself. I do know that there are fossil records which indicate, quite plush tropical plants. I do not know what the age of those fossils are.
What I'm curious about is whether that would match the 600 million and the 800 million years ago that Professor Pavlov and his hypothesis and Professor Hoffman.
I'm quite certain that all the Antarctic fossils are much more modern. The reason is that these two glaciations occurred before the Cambrian, before the so-called Precambrian explosion. And in more than 600 million years ago, there were very few macroscopic plants of any sort, and there were virtually no land plants. In fact, the land was mostly desert. There were just simply life had not yet emerged from the sea. And so, I think it's quite interesting that no global glaciation has occurred since the planet has been colonized by plants. So the point I'm making is that the Antarctic record is much younger for geologic reasons. The continental land masses have been recycled on timescales of only a few hundred million years. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pretty certain that the Antarctic fossil record does not go back anywhere near the 600 million year timescale that the global glaciation record goes back.
There is yet another cycle that scientists think has produced the several ice ages that don't extend to the equator. Those cycles relate to the way our Earth revolves around the sun in an oval orbit and not circular. and the way the Earth wobbles in its spin, sometimes leaning toward the sun and sometimes further away. That's called the precession of the Earth, which oscillates between closer and further positions in a period of about 22,000 years. According to the precession cycles currently, we should be entering into an extended period of ice sheet growth again, were we not adding vast quantities of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and upsetting the natural climatic variations that include icing of this planet. So ironically, CO2 global warming could be delaying an ice age, Whitley.
In a way, let's hope that it does, because if, we could get into a situation where we're right at the end of a normal interglacial, we should be moving into an ice age right now. And with all of the violent changes and negative changes that accompany that. However, the problem is that it could be that if global warming defeats the ice age, then we're going to go into a really bad heat cycle. It's going to be even worse.
Yes, and I think that all scientists have agreed that I've talked to that we really don't know what we're doing in this laboratory that may trigger something in the Earth's normal cycle that swings it so far off that we may regret it.
The laboratory called Earth, the experiments that take place in and with our own lives. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for a great report. This is Whitley Strieber. This has been Dreamland. Next week, William Henry interviews Lawrence Gardner on his new book, The Magdalen Legacy. Another huge wow from Lawrence Gardner. Plus, Lawrence is going to be with me in the subscriber section as well. Don't miss us next week. Stay.
I suppose, researching the story of Mary, Ferrie, and the monkey virus. Now that sounds kind of a trippy title, and it sounds like something you might find on a comic book, but there's nothing comic about the story that Ed has to relate. Ed, thank you for being with us tonight.
You're welcome. Good to be here, Jim.
Let's start off by just going back to the 50s and kind of laying the groundwork. I think most people, certainly those that were alive back in the 50s, realized that polio at that time was one of the most dreaded of the diseases. This is long before AIDS ever came on the scene, but so many people were affected by polio. President Franklin Roosevelt, of course, had suffered from polio and could barely walk, but most people were not aware of this, but because at the time before television, you only saw photographs of him from the waist up, and you didn't see pictures of him being handed downstairs and carried places. But polio was the dreaded disease of the 50s. So, Ed, why don't you take it from there and explain what brought about the situation that we're discussing?
Okay. Well, first of all, just about everybody out there that's of age, say 40 or above, has some kind of direct recollection of the hysteria that went on with the polio vaccine.
Right.
And just about everybody got it. And to most people's experience, there was a sugar cube. And actually, before the sugar cube, there was a syringe. And
I can remember getting the sugar cubes.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to say we're standing right at this moment in time at the 50th anniversary of the release of the polio vaccine. And
50 years on.
50 years, we're right on the anniversary right now, and I've been watching the press, and this is one of the most wonderfully orchestrated stories in the history of American media. And this story, as everyone is familiar with, is once upon a time there was this wonderful man named Jonas Salk who fought the great forces and invented the magic vaccine, and it was released, and we vanquished this terrible disease, and now everyone lives happily ever after. That is the story. That's almost verbatim off of the CBS website today. Now, what I did was I investigated a murder, and I wound up investigating an epidemic, okay? But I'm going to go back over the mechanics of how we got into this. Polio was a bad disease. Everyone who has seen the pictures of the crippled children laying in their iron lungs and stuff like that should have some real heartfelt sympathy and empathy for the dimensions of this very bad disease. Okay? And as I talk about it, if I sound a little callous on it, it is not because I'm not sympathetic to the dimensions of suffering that went along with this. It's that I'm aware that today we have 15 cases of soft tissue cancer for every one case of polio that we had. And so what we're going to be getting into is comparing the dimensions of one epidemic with the dimensions of another epidemic, and the cost of that, not only in human suffering, which is enormous, but the cost of it in terms of taxing our health system and those sorts of things. In order to understand this conversation, you got to go back to say, well, how did they make the polio vaccine? And there was a man, several men, but one in particular from Harvard University by the name of Enders, who figured out how to grow things in what's called a petri dish. And he figured out how to grow the polio virus on monkey kidney cells. And Jonas Salk borrowed this idea from him. And Jonas Salk created this vaccine, which was called a killed virus vaccine. And basically what he did was he drowned the polio virus.
The listeners, the viewers, the interneters, everyone that's on here. And I want to tell you that we have an incredible program lined up for you today. Today we're going to find out one of the deepest, darkest secrets, one of the biggest conspiracies that has gone on in the United States of America, and it's gone on since the 1950s, and it impacts on the lives of literally millions of Americans. If you, like me, were one of the people back in the 50s, 60s that got the polio vaccine, you need to pay careful attention to what's going to be said today, because this may be the answer to one of the most puzzling facets of recent modern American life, which is, why has the incidence of cancer literally gone through the roof? Why are there so many people suffering from cancer today like never before? We've all heard the pat excuses. Well, it's the food we eat, it's the air we breathe, it's pollution, it's the water, it's who knows what all. But let me tell you, here is the story that you need to hear. And tonight, my guest is Ed Haslam. He works for a newspaper in Florida. He is an intrepid researcher, and he has spent the better part of the last 2 decades
in formaldehyde. And then they would inject it into a person, and the structure of the cell was there, so the body would recognize it as an invader, but it wouldn't be alive so that it could infect the people. And this would trick the human's immune system into creating an immune response. Now, what most people don't know, because Jonas Salk has got the greatest PR team in the world behind him coming out of Pittsburgh, okay? What they don't know is that the Salk vaccine backfired. It failed. It was withdrawn from the market. When it was withdrawn from the market, the head of Health, Education, and Welfare, who was the wife of the governor of Texas, was fired. So was the entire management of the National Institute of Health. And Salk's vaccine was pulled off the market. Now, they handled the PR with a kiss on the cheek. They had Eisenhower give him an award on the front lawn of the White House and all that other stuff. But, boy, they swept him aside and his vaccine aside, and they went ahead with a second vaccine developed by Albert Sabin. Now, Albert Sabin said, you know, you really don't need – there's several strains of polio. You don't need to base the vaccine on the most deadly strain. You can use one of the weaker strains. And when you use one of the weaker strains, the body still recognizes it. And